Back during the summer of 2011, a few friends and I decided to organize a little camping trip to a forest just a few miles outside our hometown. Delamere Forest, despite being pretty small, presented us with a much-needed opportunity to connect with nature. City living can be good, but it can be stifling, so any chance to get out into the countryside was well received. But as time went by, and the date of the camping trip approached, things began to unravel. One by one, various friends called and texted to inform us that they wouldn't be attending, be it family illness, lack of cash, or just laziness. In the end, there was only 2 of us that actually decided to go. So early on a sunny summer morning, we boarded a train for the journey down to the forest. The weather was perfect, a cloudless sky with a light breeze that made the hike through the woods not nearly as oppressive as we were expecting. It didn't take long for us to find a decent spot in the shade that happened to be right next to a stream we could use for washing and drinking water. The only trouble was the spot was very open, visible to passerbys and not the least bit subtle. So it's late afternoon, we're tired from our hike and we decided to build a fire to cook some dinner on. But here's the thing, building a small fire is an essential part of camping, sure, but it attracts people. The smell of burning wood and the cooking food, the smoke, sometimes you might as well be announcing yourself to the whole forest with a megaphone or something. But we know this, so we're not exactly surprised when a group of locals stumbles across our little camp and comes down to say hello. They seem friendly enough at first, and this might sound paranoid, but the whole time I just had this bad feeling about them. It fascinates me how human instinct can pick up things like that. Little clues in body language or speech that leads us to believe that someone isn't being entirely genuine. I wasn't sure if it was the way the locals were looking at each other or the strange, probing questions they asked, but I knew they didn't have the best of intentions. When they moved on and were out of earshot, my friend suggested we move the camp. Now he's normally the skittish one who I'm perennially telling to calm down or chill out, but on this occasion I knew he was right. Maybe we were being a little bit paranoid, but in instances such as that, it's always better to be safe than sorry. So as tired and half drunk as we were, we packed up our stuff, doused the fire, and then started looking for another place to set up camp. Luckily, we found somewhere pretty quick, a heavily wooded hill that basically overlooked our old campsite on one side. Not that we had a direct view of it, but if you walked a minute or so away from camp, we had a pretty good view of the surrounding area. At least we did during the daytime. As the sun set, we started another fire, cooked ourselves up some ramen noodles in our mess tins, then proceeded to drink and smoke ourselves stupid. We talked nonsense around the fire until we were too tired and drunk to continue, then retired to our poncho shelters for the night. I'm pretty sure I passed out as soon as I got into my sleeping bag, as I don't remember drifting off or anything. I just know that the next thing I can recall is opening my eyes in pitch darkness to the sound of a distant car revving its engine. At first I was just annoyed to be woken up. The hangover was kicking in hard and I felt like boiled feces as I tried to fall back asleep. But the distant vehicle kept revving its engine, and as the sound grew louder and louder, I knew it was getting closer. Something told me to go and check it out by the time I started to hear voices. It might have been just a bunch of kids taking a stolen car for a spin, but like I said, sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry. But when I go to the edge of the hill, I can already see torch beams all over our old campsite. The revving engine was from a vehicle that had been driven all the way down the forest path to our previous camp. Someone was down there, looking for us. I think I acted more out of instinct than anything else, moving as quickly and quietly as I could back to my sleeping friend to wake him up. I must have explained what I'd seen like 2 or 3 times. He was just as exhausted and half drunk as I was, but when it sank in, he was up on his feet with me and helping to kick dirt on our dying fire. We then grabbed a pair of binoculars we were carrying with us, and then ran back to the edge of the hill to watch the scene below. In utter horror, we could see what was in the men's hands, thanks to the torches that they shone on one another. Baseball bats, hammers, and a length of rope were just a few of the things they carried. They spat and cursed, furious that they'd come back too late to catch us to do God knows what. All we had were our Swiss Army knives to defend ourselves with. If the guys down there had decided to actually search the area, they had found us pretty easily, and I'm not sure I'd be here typing this today. But to our infinite fortune, they didn't. Maybe they'd been drinking themselves, or were just too lazy to actually look for us, but thank God they didn't. With one person keeping watch, the other went back to camp to pack their gear as fast as they could. The guys down below were hanging around our old camp, kicking at the fire we'd so carefully constructed, taking all their spite out on the things we'd left behind. As I've mentioned before, they didn't seem keen on actually looking for us, but they didn't seem like they were in a hurry to leave either. This meant we were essentially stuck on this wooded hill, as an escape attempt with our heavy packs meant that, if we were discovered, there would be no outrunning any of them, especially since they had a vehicle. We ended up staying there until morning. Neither of us could get any sleep despite the gang leaving with their vehicle. I remember being terrified they returned with more torches, with more of a will to find us. But they didn't. They were probably sleeping off their own hangovers by the time we were on the train ride home. We were due to stay another 2 nights, and I was still annoyed we'd had to call the trip short. But with those scummy local thugs around, we just didn't want to risk it. Be careful when you're traveling around, whether it is internationally or locally, because despite the unfathomable kindness of strangers, some of them aren't so friendly. The story takes place up in Scotland a few years back. 2 friends and I took an overnight coach from Liverpool to Dumfries for a week-long wild camping trip. The major difference between wild camping and regular camping is the presence of tents. Wild campers don't take tents. They just use ponchos or tarps to make a basic shelter, then basically just sleep on the bare ground. Yeah, it can suck sometimes, but it's a challenge. It burns the fat from our souls, so to speak. So it's like 5 in the morning. We've hardly slept and we're trying to navigate our way through the Scottish countryside. Naturally, we take a wrong turn. We have 6.5 miles ahead of us, roughly 9 hours of walking, and we have taken a wrong turn 2 minutes in. I am in disbelief that we could be that dumb. Even though it's about 4:30 in the morning and we are a strange-looking trio, we stop a passing cyclist to ask directions. He is typically friendly and helpful and points us in the right direction. We turn a corner and catch a glimpse of a war memorial that would serve as a navigational checkpoint. A medley of weak cheers is droned. We cannot help but stop, lay our packs on the benches near the memorial and take a breather. The war memorial is at a crossroads. I am reminded of people taking their own lives, being buried at crossroads, and this troubles me. We are bathed in warm, golden sunlight as we make our way southwest towards Carganbridge. The pavement is narrow and we are often forced onto the road to stay level. On a rise to our left, we see our first rabbit. This seems like a good omen. We mime, aiming through imaginary scopes, making popping sounds and rubbing our bellies at it. It clocks us and scampers into a hedgerow. We continue walking under heavy packs, past a tacky fox stone house sign with 2 plastic-looking swords protruding from it. It says something in Gaelic, only in Scotland one of us pants. We reach Carganbridge and cross the brae with an old blacksmith's dwelling at its foot, working our way up a gentle slope past the local secondary school and reach the farm track. We have made good time and there are no farmhands in the fields, just scores of grazing livestock. The farmer's house is exceptionally trim, but the cattle shed and neighboring building are run down and I suspect home to bats. Sheep and months-old lambs spot us and skip away skittishly. We navigate past the cattle shed and clamber over 2 fences to avoid a giant waste tank. This had inadvertently put us right in front of another kind of fence, the electrified kind. Is that electric? Someone whines. I follow the wire with my gaze and see it dig sharply, connecting with a battery unit. I grimace. It is too high to bound over, and our packs make it impossible to crawl under it. I imagine what it feels like to receive an electric shock to my testicles. I spot a large piece of deadwood and, surrounded by fresh cow pats and, as if they were landmines, avoid them nervously and drag the deadwood to the fence. It is heavy enough to pin it down. As I step over, I hear it buzzing faintly. We continue across 2 fields, climbing the fence between them. This is not easy with a heavy pack. I take out my iPhone to film the ascent of the first of many hills. We start to breathe heavily as our packs suddenly feel twice as heavy, and we lean forward to maintain momentum. Our steps are strained and small. I put the phone away. At the steepest point, the banter ceases and we heave ourselves up the grassy ascent. I start to feel hungry and our first rest point comes into view. A planned stop to orient and order ourselves. We lay down our packs just a few yards away from where we pitched our tent on the previous trip, and rest our aching legs. My friend Corky takes his shirt off. It is soaked with sweat, and I notice steam rising from his shoulders. Jesus, Martin, the other guy, exclaims. There's actual steam coming off of you. We laugh as we take out tobacco and food. Martin and I have the same Scotch oatcakes. We eat them with cheese spread and share Martin's jet-boiled coffee. The jet boil is an incredibly handy little gadget and will almost become the center of our lives for the next week. Corky puts on my dry civilian clothes and eyes up a tin of all-day breakfast, proceeding to read out some of the ingredients. It is much cooler here in the shade, and we gaze out across the landscape, either picking bits of oatcake out of our teeth or smoking rolled cigarettes. It is already 7 in the morning, yet our sleep deprivation makes it seem later in the day. This is mildly disorienting, yet we estimate arrival at La Hulber by around 10. Corky is skeptical of this. The wrong turn was not a satisfying enough speed bump, and he is still expecting one. This feeling is justified. After moving slowly but steadily cross-country along the ridge of the hill, we reach the small collection of houses that serve as a landmark. After some deliberation, we decide to cross a field of cows that has the only traversable fence we can see. We're motivated partly because it seems quick and easy, partly because it avoids another more vicious-looking electric fence. About halfway across the field, I notice the numerous cows begin to stare at us. This is not usually particularly intimidating, but their number and obviously hostile glares make me slow my step. They're all looking at us, I say. They're just curious, Martin says. The cows begin walking towards us, spreading out in a line. I am reminded of almost a battle formation. They're walking towards us now. They just want to have a look at us, Martin says. The cows start into a trot and then a cumbersome gallop. Corky stops and starts to walk backwards. Dude, they're running at us. I too stop and begin to turn. Over my shoulder, I see a small enclosure with electrical conductors in it. Bail, dude, bail. Corky yelps, and we try to run under our packs. This amounts to hobbling. I have already weighted up and have decided death by electricity has to be quicker than trampling. Don't run! Martin screams. Instantly, the order fires synapses in my brain. I stop, spin around, and throw my arms into the air, making myself appear large. Corky repeats the same motion, simultaneously and without regarding me. The charging cows seem to respond instantly. Some stop, the rest slow their pace. I hear an indistinct shouting coming from the other side of the field. It is the farmer, bidding us to advance along the fence to the gate. See, we're good. Just keep moving, Mart says, reassured. We move slowly and compactly, arms outstretched as the cows surround us and jostle for a view of us. They are aggressive with each other. Some mount the cows in front of them for a glimpse. This is all okay, I say to myself. This is all going to be okay. Nice cows. This is completely safe. This isn't really Paro. I want to laugh, but I cannot. I am genuinely terrified. limbs shaking. I climb over the wooden gate as the farmer addresses us. They're just curious. They're just come up for a wee look. If you're along the edge of the field, you'll do all right, if you've gone across then. He then breaks off and looks away. Then I don't know. Could you tell us a good route to Maybe House? Just follow this road here. It's usually quiet, then turn right at the main road and follow it. Don't turn off into the farm. Just keep it going and you'll find the road to the house, or key. Yeah, cheers, mate. We are delighted for his assistance. He seems mildly interested in us, but is obviously too annoyed by the commotion to show it. Pretty much every time I told this story since, people have laughed. I get that. I can see why a bunch of city kids getting scared by cows is definitely somewhat comedic. But it did scare the life out of us, especially when we got home from the trip and realized just how much danger we were really in. You see, cows kill more people each year than sharks do, in pretty much the exact way I described. A hiker or country walker decides to cut across a field, not around it or using the edge, and they get trampled by cows. In fact, the UK Health and Safety Executive has since reissued long-standing advice to farmers not to put calves and their mothers in fields accessible to the public as a precaution. That is straight up pulled from an article from the British newspaper The Independent. So next time you fancy taking a shortcut through a field, make sure it's not occupied. You could get a nasty, very unexpected surprise. Ouachita National Forest is the oldest of its kind in the southern United States, nearly 2 million acres of untouched wilderness that make for some of the best hunting trips imaginable. In fact, it is said that Ouachita is composed of the Choctaw word of Owa for hunting and Shito for big, together meaning big hunt far from home. So as you can imagine, during hunting season, you can't move for high-vis jackets and bright orange hunter caps. My buddies and I have never really been into hunting. We're about as East Coast as they come. I mean, until we visited Arkansas, I barely even made it past Pennsylvania. So our idea of relaxing in nature does not include butchering a freshly killed animal. So when we discovered that there was a window during high summer, when hunting in the Ouachita is strictly forbidden, we were absolutely elated. There'd be entire sections of the forest that would be basically deserted. We'd have the place to ourselves, or so we thought. We drove for 8 hours a day for 3 days to make it all the way to Arkansas from our home in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Since 1,500 miles in one sitting was too nauseating to think about, we made a little road trip out of it, stopping in Philly, DC, and then Nashville. Honestly, I think I could move to DC just for the mumbo sauce. I saw it on Anthony Bourdain and just had to try it. Trust me, it does not disappoint. But anyway, by the time we finally made it to Ouachita National Forest, we were seriously ready to relinquish the trappings of society and embrace the tranquility and purity of nature, which is a fancy-pants way of saying we were ready to get blind drunk around a roaring fire and sing Dropkick Murphy songs at the top of our lungs, which we did, maybe with a little too much enthusiasm, as after just 2 out of the 4 nights we were due to camp in the Ouachita, we ran out of beer and tobacco. Not exactly at an opportune moment either. It was late in the afternoon when we opened our coolers to discover just 3 untouched cans, just enough to keep us company on what would surely be hours of walking to the nearest liquor store. Outlaw Liquor was a little more than a wooden shack on the outskirts of a small town called Crystal Springs. It took us about 3 hours of solid walking to get there, and I can promise you, it's worth every step. At first, we weren't sure if we were in a liquor store or a hunting lodge. There were taxidermies of black bears, buck, turkeys, and red foxes dotted all over the place. Jeff, the owner, showed us all the locally made wines and spirits and even gave us samples of a few choice fermentations. We walked in with the intention of grabbing a 6-pack or 2 and left with our backpacks full of beers, some of Jeff's homemade beef jerky, and a few little bottles of homebrew wine. along with a bottle, each of what Jeff the owner called barrel-aged Abraxas, a locally brewed stout that was 11%. Yep, you read that right. 11%. The sun was beginning to drip below the horizon by the time we were anywhere near our campsite, as aching feet from hours of walking were numbered by the booze we sipped as we walked. I had already cracked open my own little pack of jerky, passing out strips of it as we hoped that it might soak up a little of the booze. We were at that point in a drinking session when bladders are getting a little too full, so every so often our journey back to the camp, we'd stop so one of us could take a walk off in the trail to urinate. It was a beautiful evening. Crickets chirped as bats flew around our heads, chirping softly as they used their sonar to hone in on flying insects. When it was my turn to call for a pee break, my buddies sat down on the edge of the trail with their beers as I wandered off into the woods to find a decent spot. I found one, did my thing, and then started to turn back when I heard something through the trees. It sounded like people. Hushed voices and footfalls among the fallen leaves. In my stupid, half-boozed state, I thought it might be a good idea to introduce myself. Maybe we could have a few drinks, tell some stories, make some friends. But these people did not want to be friends. As I pushed through a patch of dense brush and into a small woodland clearing, it became clear that wanting to introduce myself was a terrible idea. The moment I emerged, 3 or 4 guys in the clearing, turning to look at me in angry surprise. They were in rough clothing, ragged leather boots, and a lot of denim. Each had some kind of weapon in their hands, machetes, bowie knives. One of them had this rusted spiked club that looked like it could have been 100 years old. Between them, hog-tied and writhing in the dirt, was a young woman, her body a mosaic of bruises and abrasions. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Never in my life had I heard anything so upsetting as the noises she made through her cloth gag. When I finally unglued my eyes from the sight before me, I looked up at one of the hillbilly-looking guys looming over the prostrate girl. He was smiling, and with one smooth motion he raised a single finger to his lips. Shh. I turned and started walking, slowly at first. I didn't want those guys to think I was panicking, that I was going to call the cops or something. I tried to stay calm, but after a few seconds, I started running, sprinting towards the trail. I didn't need to say a word to my friends. They started sprinting too as soon as they saw my face. We ran and ran and ran, until my buddy puked up beer and half-digested jerky all over himself. But by that point, we were out of danger. No one was following us. When I told them exactly what I'd seen, an argument ensued. One of my friends went to call the cops immediately, while the other insisted we had to get out of the woods as soon as possible. This would mean driving his car well over the limit until we could find a motel. We could not call the cops and risk a DUI, not in Missouri. We concluded that we'd call the cops first, then get out of there into a hotel before we got pulled over, breathalyzed, and arrested. We never heard back from the cops. My buddy reported what I'd seen over the phone in as much detail as he could, but I never got closure for what I'd seen that night. I often wonder what happened to that girl, if she ended up getting rescued or if she is living a peaceful, happy life now. But sometimes, in the darkest of moments, I know that girl didn't make it out of the Washita. Even if she was alive, a piece of her would be forever left in that little clearing in the woods, taken from her by cruel, wild men. Back in early 2014, a few friends and I had an idea to do something for charity. We discussed shaving our heads, running marathons, organizing some kind of community picnic, but nothing seemed to gain any traction. They were all tired, overused ideas. If we wanted to get donations, we needed to do something big. So when I had the idea of spending 7 nights sleeping rough after hiking 20 miles into the Brecon Beacon mountain range in Wales, I knew it was crazy enough to get donations, but I didn't think my friends would agree to it. But they did. For some inexplicable reason, they agreed. It was a numbers game. Simple. Tell people 7 nights, 20 miles, homeless for the homeless, and watch the purse string loosen. By the date of departure, we'd collected the grand total of £1,255, just over $1,500 for shelter, a British charity that helps street sleepers and those facing housing crises. We felt proud beyond words. But in the run-up to the aforementioned day of departure, we were getting pretty anxious. The Brecon beacons are used by the British Special Air Services, basically our version of Delta Force, for their training due to how rugged and wild the terrain can be. We'd also planned the trip for early April, which meant heavy rain and strong winds. This meant that we ended up investing a fair bit of our own money in military surplus equipment. We'd need a lot of gear to keep ourselves safe and warm for 7 whole nights in the beacons, and it so happened that Army surplus gear was the cheapest and most reliable option. So as you can imagine, we were covered in camouflage for the march out in the beacons. Huge rucksacks stuffed with canned food and water weighed us down as more miles meant more pain. Pain in the shoulders, pain in the feet, pain in the knees and the neck and the thighs. By mile 17, the 2 other guys who attended had thrown in the towel. I found myself the only dissenting voice as they proposed we call a taxi for the final 3 miles of the journey. One of my friends claimed his pack was ridiculously heavy, and he simply couldn't carry on marching. I wondered just what he'd brought with him that made his gear so difficult to march with. But when we reached a large freshwater lake and set up camp, I found out why. He'd brought an air rifle, a .22 pellet gun that must have accounted for almost half the weight he was carrying. Yeah, I was a little annoyed. Maybe if he'd left it behind, he'd have had it in him to keep going, but boys with toys, right? We had 8 whole days to kill. Target shooting would definitely account for a few hours of fun, not to mention if we found ourselves a tasty-looking wood pigeon or rabbit, we might be able to treat ourselves to a bit of fresh meat. So after an initial first night of exhaustion, chilling around a fire at the lake's edge before getting some sleep, we arose at dawn with a big day ahead of us. Somehow we'd gotten into our heads that a dawn hunt would be a good idea. Few people around, the wildlife would be active, but it wasn't to be. We didn't get a decent shot on a single animal, but we did run into something. At one point in the absolute middle of nowhere, we break through a tree line and find ourselves face to face with a blurry-eyed, early morning dog walker. We couldn't believe it. The chances of running into someone around here was minimal, but there someone was, looking nervously at a group of lads wearing camouflage, one of which was carrying an air rifle that looked exactly like an actual firearm. We waved, he smiled, we all moved on. We didn't think anything of it, to be honest. He didn't seem like the type to call the police or make a big deal out of it. I mean, he didn't ask questions, he didn't even mention the rifle. So by the time we made it back to our camp in time for lunch, it incidentally had been pretty much forgotten. After an afternoon of gathering firewood and other camp crafts, we settled in for an evening of fireside storytelling. I cracked out a few choice ghost stories, some of which got more laughs than spooks, while we downed a few beers before heading to sleep. A few hours later, I'm jolted awake by something. The large shelter we'd made for the 3 of us from a huge tarp should have been pitch black, but I could see rays of light penetrating from torch beams outside. Then I heard it. "Armed police, come out with your hands raised right now!" One by one, we exited the shelter, just as they ordered us to. My hands were shaking horribly as I pushed them out of the entrance and into the blinding light of 5 or 6 torches. I remember the pure gut-wrenching fear as I realized the beams of light weren't in the police's hands. They were attached to the end of whatever weapons they were carrying. I only noticed in a flash, but the realization hit me right between the eyes. I'm honestly amazed I didn't wet myself right then and there. "On the ground, now! Get on the bloody ground!" I hit the dirt, hands on the back of my head as my two friends followed. Soon, all three of us were lying face down on the cold, wet forest floor as the armed police searched our shelter. It didn't take them long to find the air rifle. "Got it, boss," one of them called out. I couldn't see any of this, but it was obvious based on what they were saying. "Is that it? That's your lot, yeah? Just a pellet gun by the looks of it? Wait, so you three aren't pathfinders or something?" It took a minute before we found the balls to speak up. No. Not military at all, no? No. Three of us said at once. "Oh, well, all right then." The police officer in charge took a few guys back down the trail a little and had a little huddle. From what I could figure out, the dog walker who had seen us had mistakenly thought that we were British Army, lost in maneuvers, and had decided to inform the authorities. I don't know if this is standard procedure for civilians in the area. I mean, they must be used to the presence of armed men in the beacons, but sometimes I think he may have thought we were going AWOL or something and made the decision to call it in. There are a lot of ex-officers living in the beacons. Maybe he was one of them. But I digress. The armed police had us get up off the ground before they questioned us as to why we were there. We were honest to a fault, told them it was a charity thing, homeless for the homeless, or whatever maxim we'd adopted for the fundraising. Aside from the air rifle, they actually seemed pretty impressed. I figured they'd be annoyed at the false alarm, but in reality, an armed policeman getting the call means overtime pay and hunting idiots in the woods with real guns, not crappy pellet guns. This wasn't some inconvenience for them. They live for this stuff. It was surreal, but they left having only confiscated the air rifle. They left us our knives and fishing gear, even though we admitted to not having a fishing permit for any of the local lakes. They talked about smelling something funny in the air, but still didn't search our tent for anything. Even though I know that they'd found a lot, we didn't want them to. They also verbally assured us that we'd not be charged with anything. Just don't do it again, boys, yeah?" was all they had to say on the subject. We actually went back to collect the air rifle too. In the back of my mind, I was sure they'd go back on their word and arrest us at the police station. There are some serious armed trespass laws in the UK, and to this day, I have literally zero clue as to why they didn't charge us with anything. I'd like to think that they were impressed with the whole charity thing that they decided to come down lightly on us. But in reality, I think we just got lucky. After all, I still think we're extremely lucky that our pellet gun wasn't the only thing they'd taken from us that night. One wrong move, I might not even be here to type this. A few years back, a few friends and I went on a camping trip in the Scottish Highlands. It was tough going. The weather was unforgiving and the terrain even more so, but the trip was an overall success. No one got hurt, no one got lost, nothing remotely unnerving or scary happened at all. At least until the last night, when we arrived back in the small Scottish village we were due to catch a bus in. We were physically and emotionally exhausted by the time we arrived back in the small highland village that served as our line of departure. 5 nights in the mountains will do that to you. We had barely slept and barely eaten, so the sight of a small, greasy spoon cafe almost brought tears to our eyes. We drew stares from the locals, and to be honest, I don't blame them. We were a mess of bloodshot eyes and greasy hair. All of our clothes reeked of smoke from huddling around a fire at night. They were curious, but still friendly. The owner questioned us on our trip and took a great deal of pleasure in our fascination with the Highlands. It always earns you brownie points with the locals when you tell them they must be tough, hard-working people to live in such a barren place. We left with full stomachs and headed to the nearest and only pub in the village. They were equally welcome, and even stayed open an hour or so later than usual, just so we'd have somewhere to keep warm until our late-night bus was set to arrive. We left the pub with about 20 minutes before our bus was due, having heartily thanked the bar staff for accommodating us, then made our way along almost barely lit streets towards the village's one and only bus stop. Now, it's important to note that the bus stop is located just next to a small bridge which provides a crossing point over the river that runs through the village. So in the low light of semi-functioning streetlights, we knew that there was a bridge. We just couldn't see what was on it at any one time. The minutes are ticking by and we're all clock watching. We can't wait to go home to hot showers, warm beds, and properly cooked food. There must have been less than 10 minutes to wait when we heard something from the other side of the river, a grunting sound, but I think we were too buzzed and exhausted to make anything of it. But the sound continues, getting louder and more vocal until we realize there's someone on the other side of the bridge, someone who sounded drunk, someone who sounded angry. I can't remember who, but someone was curious enough to gather the energy to go check it out. I wasn't watching, but I could hear their heavy footsteps and boots against the metal bridge, moving slowly to the top. Then there was a humdrum of noise as they came down the bridge stairs faster than they'd gone up. "Grab your bags now," he hissed, trying to keep his voice down. "Come on, move." We had no idea what was going on. In fact, I thought it might be some sort of prank. Some lame attempt to inject a little excitement into the final hour of our trip. But one look in his eyes told me he was serious. I had never seen my friend that scared before, ever. As if to confirm what he was saying, I began to hear the same kind of footstep noise on the metal bridge. Someone was moving fast across the bridge from the other side, making the same angry grunting noises we'd been hearing. None of us wanted to take a chance, so we all grabbed our heavy packs and dragged them across the road and into a small, dark village street. We were fairly concealed in the darkness, but we still had a good look at our side of the bridge, each of us wanting to see just what had scared our mate so much. Then we saw it. A man staggering down the bridge's metal stairs with something in his grip, the glinting of stainless steel in the low light. Jesus Christ, is that a machete? No sooner had one of us exclaimed that, the man honed in on the sound of our voices. He raised the huge blade in his fist, pointing it towards the dark alleyway that we thought was concealing us. "You!" he roared in his rough Scottish accent, then began to bound down the bridge's stairs towards us, waving the machete as he ran. We bolted, hurtling down the small dark street. We had no idea where we were going, but anywhere that wasn't in the immediate vicinity of this drunken, blade-wielding maniac had to be better. Whoever was in the lead must have had the presence of mind to loop around the block. If we got too far away from the bus stop, we'd miss our ride, and the only other inner-city bus to roll through the village wasn't due for another 2 days. He explained this to us the first chance he got, and we all rued the situation we were faced with. Go back to the bus stop and risk getting stabbed, or stay away from the bus stop, miss our bus, and end up stuck in the middle of nowhere in Scotland. It was like a military operation or something. We moved in pairs, covering each other's movement and watching for any sign of our potential murderer. Somehow we made it back towards the bus stop without running into him. We figured we'd lost him and started to relax as best we could. It was about 5 minutes after the bus was due to arrive and we were starting to panic again. Some of us had gotten it into their heads that we'd missed the bus entirely, and we better start looking for a decent place to bed down before we ran into the machete wielder again. But they didn't have to wait long, as a few minutes later, a familiar-looking figure emerged from one of the poorly lit side streets. Our collective hearts sank when we saw what he had in his grip, the machete. It was the same guy. "You!" he roared again before slowly walking towards us. This time we took a different tact. I don't know if it was the adrenaline or the pure desperation to catch the bus and get our butts out of there, but we stood our ground. We roared back at him, pulled out our pathetically small Swiss Army knives and dared him to try us. Looking back on it, it was kind of glorious. We went from terrified vermin, scattered through the streets, to full-on warriors willing to defend their ground. What happened next was like something out of a film. As we were facing the dude, we began pacing back and forth in the street, zigzagging toward us in the street, still waving his machete. He was obviously deterred slightly by our newfound aggression, but it obviously didn't deter him entirely. A horrible feeling came over me as I realized that one of us could well be about to suffer life-changing injuries. But in the distance, near where the road pulled away from the river's course, a police van came trundling around the corner, revving towards the scene to our rescue. It was like the cavalry showing up in an old western, and we were saved. Our bravado doubled, and we actually began to advance up to him, pushing him towards the approaching police that he was somehow completely oblivious of. He only realized what was happening when the van skidded to a stop behind him, and a trio of burly-looking Scottish policemen jumped out and pounced on him. He got tackled, hard. So hard you heard the sickening thud of his head slamming into the concrete. But we had zero sympathy. We cheered as the bedroom's lights of nearby dwellings flickered on and faces began to appear in windows to watch the melee. Then, as all this is happening, the bloody bus turns up, coming around the same corner the police van did. We continued to cheer, grabbing our bags and padding victoriously towards our ride home. The police wanted to talk to us about what had happened, but backed off once we explained that this was our one ride out of town. I told them we'd be in touch to make telephone statements, but we never ended up getting in touch. We were all just so glad to be out of there, in one piece. I loved camping. I used to spend every waking moment either camping or planning a camping trip. I love being outdoors, away from the suffocating mundanity of everyday events, the first world problems. I used to do it pretty hardcore too, making shelters instead of taking a tent, drinking from mountain streams, hunting and setting traps for our food. So in April of last year, 2 friends and I departed on a 4-night hiking camping trip on the Appalachian Trail. With loads in excess of 50 pounds, we marched 20 miles into the lush green hills before reaching our first major water source, a long strip of tranquil, clear water set in a picturesque valley. The journey took 2 days with around 18 hours of straight marching. Our packs began digging agonizingly into our shoulders with every step, yet the sense of achievement was intoxicating. Days and nights rolled by as we worked our way along the trail, foraging food as we went. It was tiring, a constant struggle, but the sense of peace that the outdoors can provide is profound. At night, we skewered hot dogs on sticks, wolfing them down as we warmed sweet apple cider in our mess tins over the fire. We listened to owls call out like ghosts and watched embers dancing up in the air like fireflies as our eyelids grew heavy. We had found a fair amount of fruit and fresh water was plentiful, but our attempts at finding protein came short at each turn. We were unable to find any duck eggs, too slow or too inexperienced to snare rabbits, and our improvised fishing rods weren't working as well as we were used to. We were getting desperate, and although we were trying, man cannot live on cereal bars and peanut butter alone. We would have to make a journey to the nearest town, nearly 7 miles away. Needless to say, we got lost. After a few hours of walking, we began to climb a fairly steep hill by means of a shortcut. The whole way up, I remember watching a thick fog cling to the top of the hill, at least 500 meters above us. Only it wasn't exactly clinging. It was just waiting for the temperature to drop low enough for it to roll down onto us, over us, and it did. I remember the image my friend Chris being severely obscured as I walked behind him. We tried to remain cheerful when we started to see the remains of newborn lambs. April is birthing month for sheep, so this isn't necessarily an unusual sight, but these remained completely unscathed. No scavengers had touched these corpses, and there were a lot of them. Needless to say, we were relieved when the outline of a cottage came into view. We had absolutely no idea where we were, and there was no mention of any cottage on our map. My feet ached and our water supplies dwindled, having not expected to be out or lost for such a long time. We decided to stop and ask for directions. We had to climb over a low dry stone wall to reach the building itself, as the cottage was oddly set in the hillside. I noted with grim interest that there was no path leading to or from any kind of road or highway, the dwelling being completely cut off from all human contact. We stopped as we reached the front gate, or what passed as a front gate. It was made of a few roughly cut tree limbs, crudely bound with rusty nails and rotting twine. Chris tried to open it, but there was no hinge. It just fell back into his hands. He set it aside politely, albeit confusedly. The small courtyard before the front door was overgrown with weeds, grass growing long between broken slabs of concrete beneath our feet. Dotted around a smaller front garden was an assortment of curios placed in decorative positions. Things were tied to the branches of a sapling in the center of the haggard lawn, small toy cars, a tennis ball, a hairbrush. A wheelbarrow sat at the foot of it, filthy from exposure, containing a few soggy-looking books, some VHS cassettes, and a children's action figure. They were oddly arranged in a rough circle around the action figure. Arriving nervously at the door, I reached my arm out, feeling it grow heavy as I made a fist. I rapped 3 times, feeling it shake under the force, then waited, listening for signs of life, peering through a small, filthy window to the right of the decrepit door. I could make out yet more assorted, seemingly non-related items scattered on shelves and tables. That's when I turned to Chris. I remember simply remarking that we should move on, that there was no one home. But he didn't respond. There was something about him. He looked pale and confused. I can hardly explain it now that I try to recall it. He'd been looking through the grubby windows as I'd been knocking on the door and had gotten a much better look inside the house. It was almost like he had seen something, but just couldn't explain what. He began shaking his head violently, hyperventilating as he rushed out of the little courtyard. I was confused, a little frightened, and began shouting after him, asking just why he was acting so strange. Yeah, the little cottage was weird, but he was acting like he'd seen a ghost. He only replied to me once through gritted teeth. "We need to leave now." Later that night, while we were nursing beers around our campfire, I finally plucked up the courage to ask him what he'd seen through the window. He started shaking his head in that same weird way, stuttering as he tried to find the words to articulate himself. He went on to explain that someone had been in that cottage the whole time, hiding from us. That as I'd been banging away trying to get their attention, that they'd taken one solitary look outside at us, right into my buddy's eyes. My buddy said that he had never seen anyone so messed up, that he couldn't tell if they were disabled or they had just been beaten so badly that their face had been rearranged. He said that when they locked eyes, the figure on the other side of the glass had looked terrified, but there's no way that they could have been surviving alone up there. Something else was living there too, something that might have been heading back to us to arrive at any moment. I thank God we didn't find out what it was. At least once a year, my stepdad's family has a little camping trip get-together down in South Carolina. My mom has been married to him for about 6 years now, so I've had the opportunity to attend a handful of them when my job permits me to do so. The first trip I attended was right after Mom and my stepdad got married. Alone with my little brother, we loaded up my stepdad's truck with camping gear and made the 9-hour drive from our home in Pittsburgh down to his native South Carolina. We had just passed the state line into West Virginia when we first stopped for gas. All of us piled out of the truck to stretch our legs and use the bathroom, while my stepdad handed down an elderly attendant a few bucks to get us filled up. I finished up in the bathroom, then headed back to the truck when I got into a little conversation with the elderly attendant. He seemed nice enough at first, asking where we were headed, how long for, that sort of thing. But when I mentioned that we were camping, his mood seemed to shift. "You know, you should always be respectful in nature. It can be unforgiving," he explained. "Don't mess with the animals. Don't leave nothing but your boot prints. Any mess and, well, The woods have a way of letting you know you're not welcome. I assured him we had the utmost respect for nature and we wouldn't be leaving any trash around when we left, but this didn't seem to change his demeanor at all. He finished pumping our gas and went back to his chair without a word. Several hours later, we were well into South Carolina when we made a final rest stop before the campgrounds. It was basically a wildlife preserve that was also a truck stop, complete with a little information board that told us about the local flora and fauna. But something caught my eye in the bottom corner of the board. Carved into the white plastic were just 2 words: respect, nature. Those were the words the gas station attendant had said to me. It was weird, sure, but it had to be coincidence. The same words, yeah, but hundreds of miles apart. There was no way it could be the same guy. I mean, that stuff only happens in dumb horror movies. Naturally, I didn't bother mentioning this to my mom or stepdad. I mean, why would I? I'd have seemed crazy. I would have been crazy to think that there was some connection between the gas attendant and the scrawled message. So we just got back in the truck and pushed on towards the campground. Upon arrival, we say hello to the extended family. A little round robin of hugs and handshakes, then get to work putting up the large, luxury glamping tent that we'd been sleeping in. Once we're done there, we head back and hang out with the family and fill up on barbecue. My stepdad's entire family was just as delightful as he was, and I feel like at this point I should add that my stepdad was a far better parent than our biological dad. So aside from the initial period of them dating, I was glad my mom had found someone so good for her. After an evening around the fire, singing old songs with my step-uncle on the guitar, we headed back to our tents to get some sleep. But on arrival, we see something lying in the grass just near the entrance. It was a dead bird. My little brother starts freaking out. The thing was starting to decompose, and a huge collective ew echoed through the trees when the smell hit us. My stepdad calmed us down, saying something about my little brother's car farts smelling way worse, then proceeds to get rid of the thing as we get ready for bed. But I watched him in the light of his own torch as he used a stick to get the feathery little cadaver away from our campground. He knelt down into the dirt and pulled something from under the bird's rotten wing, something that looked like a note. When I asked him about it, he brushed the question off like he hadn't found anything. I would have followed up with more questions, but when I saw the look in his eyes, I decided against it. He was spooked, like seriously spooked. The next morning, some of the other family members mentioned hearing footsteps outside their tent during the day. They were asking around, trying to find out who went on a walkabout, if we had any sleepwalkers in the group who might be the ones responsible. But to no avail. No one would admit to being the one out of their tent so late. That's when the atmosphere started to get a little uneasy. The second night was a little less eventful. There were no footsteps outside anyone's tents, but I did hear something that meant I hardly got any sleep at all. In the dead of night, I could hear my little brother's voice across the tent. At first I figured he was reading aloud, as was common when he was that age. But there was no flashlight, so he didn't have a book. I strained my eyes and ears trying to make out what he was whispering. I thought I was going crazy when I finally made out the words. There was no way he was saying what I thought he was saying, but he was. He was reciting the information that was present on the wildlife board back at the rest stop we hit when we got into South Carolina. It sounded like he was reeling it off, word for word, like he was using all these big words that I knew my little brother didn't know off the top of his head. He eventually stopped, but I was so freaked out that I just couldn't manage to get any decent sleep. I woke up exhausted to the sound of my stepdad's voice. He sounded unusually stern when I stepped outside into the campground, and I saw why. Everyone was packing their stuff up and piling it into their various vehicles. We were due to stay another couple of nights at least, but the mood was tense. People weren't speaking to each other as they quickly packed up their gear. My stepdad asked me to help out getting packed up, and to do so as quickly as possible. The look in his eyes told me not to ask questions. we were back on the road to Pennsylvania by noon. I was so glad to be out of there that I managed to keep my mouth shut all the way back home. I needed to know just what had happened to freak everyone out so much. I also needed to ask him what he'd pulled off of that dead bird on the first night, but the timing needed to be right. We got home in the late evening, so late that my stepdad had to carry my sleeping brother from the car and right up to the bed. After some late supper, I managed to catch him alone in front of the TV. He knew what I wanted to ask before I'd even spoke. There'd been a note on the dead bird, just as I'd expected. He told me it had said, "Go home," but had figured it was either a prank by local teenagers or one of his cousins who'd resented that he'd left the Carolinas for the Yankee North, so he'd ignored it. I asked him if he'd heard my little brother sleep-talking, but when he shot me a confused look, I knew he hadn't heard it himself. But he did go on to explain what had gotten the family so freaked out that they'd chosen to flee the campground. The cousin who he suspected of the first note had woken up at dawn with a bladder full of beer. Sleepy-eyed, he shuffled out of his tent, peed, and then headed back a little more awake. That's when he noticed the dead deer laying near the fire pit. Someone had left it as a message. He woke up my stepdad and got him to move the deer before anyone else woke up and freaked out. Soon as that was done, they woke their families up and got everyone moving. But that's not the worst part. My stepdad explained that whoever had left the dead deer had carved something into its flesh. They must have cut into the deer while it was still alive, as he said the letters were formed more out of clotted blood than open gashes. He said it was just 2 words, 2 little words. I asked him what they said. He sighed, unable to bring himself to look at me in the eyes. "Final warning," he replied. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, or Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured in the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And if you love longer videos, be sure to check out my podcast, the Let's Read Podcast, available on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you at Area 51.